Alrighty, so today I'm going to be doing a breakdown of all the legendary cards in Twilight of the Republic, everyone's favorite card rarity. I'll be talking about all 16 of them, kind of putting them into rankings or tiers based on my first impressions about how powerful they are or what we can do with them. And yeah, hope this is helpful for you. Before we get going, please hit that subscribe button. Go check out my Patreon if you're looking for a little more extra content from me. All right, let's get to it. So at number 16, we got Planetary Invasion. It's going to be all on its own in its own tier as what I think is likely the least powerful legendary in this set. The effect is pretty cool. It might be nice to build around. I just think it was designed in a way that will make very safe, if that makes sense, that it probably just won't be able to go off. With Exploit 3, we can get it down to 6, and it's readying 3 units, so kind of to get the big bang for your buck, you need at least 6 units in play. 3 of them to sacrifice, 3 of them to ready up. 3 of those units needed to have already attacked. It's a lot of actions, it's a lot of units, it's just not something I think happens very often. The buff that it gives is nice, but like +1, +0 is not a ton. It just gives so much time and space for your opponent to interact with this. It reminds me a little bit of like Final Showdown from set 2, except that just readies all your units for 6. This readies 3 units for 6 if you also sacrifice 3 units. So I think this will be fun to mess around with, but in the end, it's just not going to be there on power level. I don't think this really has much of a shot as I envision the game right now to really make a dent. All right, next I've got a bucket of 5 cards, so we'll say it's like number 11 through 15. We got Peric Assault, Unlimited Power, Satine Kryze, Chancellor Palpatine, and Resolute. I'll start with the double aspect cards here. Peric Assault is actually a pretty interesting card. I'm just having difficulty seeing where it really fits. Double green is kind of a strange color. It is a place where you probably have the easiest access to making a lot of tokens right now, but it also usually you want to like use those tokens to be aggressive, and Peric Assault really rewards you for wanting to trade into opponent's units or having your opponent attack into your units. It costs 3, which means during that turn you are already spending a good chunk of resources just kind of setting this up, and again, are we trying to just like bash our units into their stuff? In that sense, you would want to get probably at least 6 damage off of this to be sort of happy, but I'm not even sure that would be enough for all the hoops you have to jump through. So I think this one, though, would be a little more interesting to build around than the one we just saw at 16. But again, not really seeing a place where this would be like a major main deck build around, but more so maybe something we could potentially sideboard in some cases as sort of like a defensive maneuver for a double green deck. Unlimited Power, on the other hand, I think the issue with this card is it's costing 6, and the most burst you can do with it is 4. Like, the biggest unit you're removing is 4. That's open fire level of removal, but this costs 6. At that point, you really need this removing something bigger. I think the rate is pretty low in that sense. Additionally, if your opponent has less than 4 units, you actually have to damage one of your own units if you have one. So it's not like you even can stop it at 3 hits, right? You'd have to do 1 damage to one of your own units. Where I do see this potentially fitting in is with a Mace Windu deck, primarily because his flip would then do an additional 2 to everything that you had already damaged. It's a bit slow, but that actually makes it a little interesting. So like a double red Mace deck. The question is, do we want to play a double red Mace deck? Maybe. And I think we definitely would try this card in a deck like that. But outside of that, I think the rate is way too low. Satine Kryze, you know, this is going to definitely get... People are going to try this. There's people who really want to play like a really hard control strategy, and this maybe fits into that kind of build because, you know, it can close out a game a little quicker than what they currently can, especially if they're going after your deck. However, this costs 4. In a villain deck, it would cost 6, right? And that feels like way too much of an investment for a card that doesn't actually do anything when you play it. In fact, it does do something when you play it. It gives your opponent this action that they can do. Satine, of course, cannot use this action when she is played because she will be exhausted. So not only are you the one up front paying for this effect, your opponent gets to use it first. If you're playing a hard controlling strategy that wants to deck your opponent out, that usually means you don't want to be playing a lot of units because it doesn't really fit into that game plan. Certainly not a unit that has absolutely no way to interact with the board. So either she'll be like free food for your opponent's removal that they can't spend on anything else, or their units can kill her, or if they want, they can start defeating your deck too. So it'll be interesting to see if this makes a dent even in the slightest, but I think this is costed in such a way that, again, they played it safe, and this is unlikely, I think, to elevate a milling strategy through to the stratospheres. Chancellor Palpatine, another double aspect card. So I have like all three of the double aspect legendaries up here. He looks really cool, but I think he's incredibly clunky. You play him, he doesn't do anything. You ready up next turn. If you wanted to attack with him, he still wouldn't do anything because he has that. The only way he makes the clone is if you remove something from play first. Now that does synergize pretty well with bounce. I get it. But you're playing 4 for a 2/6, which is not where you want to be, and then you require even more setup than just that. Now the tokens come in ready, so you have other ways to make tokens. That is cool. I looked at like a double Palp, the new Palp. He's in Cunning, but the problem is this Chancellor is not villain or heroism, so he wouldn't even flip the leader or enable a flip, which soured me on it a little more. Overall, I don't see a double yellow deck being a kind of deck that like A, wants a bunch of token synergy, and B, being in the market for a 4 cost that is such a actually negative tempo play. This is not a very impactful unit to play for 4 resources. And the last one in this tier is Resolute. This card just isn't very good. It probably could have been even lower than the rest of these. To make this cost anywhere near relevant, you probably need 20 damage on your base, so that this would cost 6, and then you're paying 6 for an 8/8 that deals 2 damage to something, and you're playing it out in space, and then you're probably just dead because you're at 20, and you played a 6 cost close to do nothing. This doesn't help you stabilize, and it needs you to be near dead to play it for a good price, and that's a problem, right? If this had Sentinel, if this had a way to actually kill a large unit, could be a little interesting. But the only thing this would stabilize against is an army of clone troopers, and as such, probably a pretty big miss. All right, next at the 9-10, we got Clone and Ki-Adi-Mundi. These are fine. I think Clone is likely going to be an overrated card in general because it's flashy, and it's like you envision all these cool scenarios where like your opponent plays a Maul and then you copy it, or your opponent plays a Luke and you copy it, or even bigger like a Snoke or a Crate Dragon. Crate probably wouldn't be good because it would kill itself, like you'd take 7. But anyway, the issue with a card like this is that it's costed in such a way, again, a little too safe, I think. When you're cloning, I think you have downside kind of built into the card because it requires a target that's good. And the problem with this costing 7 is most of the targets you'd want to clone cost 7. So you're not even getting a discount. So you're eating all the downside of needing a good target either on your own side or your opponent's side. But you're not really getting much of a benefit because, again, why not just play the card that costs 7 instead of playing Clone? Clone is way more situational than just playing a 7-drop that you will always be able to play, as opposed to this where, oh no, the best thing I can steal now is a 4-drop. Guess Clone is bad right now. It doesn't steal vehicles, which I think probably is the biggest issue, right? Because if you could clone like an Avenger or a Devastator, that would be a much different scenario. But as currently constructed, maybe the fact that it has the clone trait, and so something like Omega can go find it from your deck, is a little more interesting. But overall, it's kind of in the middle there. We might see a little bit of it as like redundancy in some strategies, the way like things like Choose Sides or Palpatine's Returns get played, like in that vein. Although I think it's likely just weaker than those two cards. Ki-Adi-Mundi. The only reason he's not lower is because he's decent with Han too, who he could come out as a 4-cost 5/5. I think his text is largely irrelevant. It's too conditional. Not only does it have coordinate, which is already going to be tough to pull off, especially when you're trying to play 5-cost 5/7s in your deck. Like, coordinate really wants cheaper units. But then on top of that, your opponent has to play their second card. An interesting kind of thing you can do with this is if your opponent plays a card first and then you play Ki-Adi-Mundi, now if they wanted to play another card, you would get the 2 draws. And that, if it's able to be squeezed into some kind of curve, could be interesting. But because he is really chunky and he costs 5, he'd be a 5/5 for 4 in a Han 2 deck, that's interesting. Han 2 often plays something like Poe. Poe is a 6/4 usually in that deck because they cheat him out. So Poe obviously has a much more like upside because his on attack is very significant, but his 4 health sometimes is a liability. So being able to do something like Ki-Adi-Mundi instead of what currently would have likely been Rey as the best choice, there would have been a 4/5, but Ki-Adi is a 5/5. So interesting, right? He's got good traits. He's not a bad card. It's just still fits in that range of like 5 and 6 cost units that don't really have much of an immediate impact. And then if you're not using them with like Energy Conversion Lab, they often just like don't make the cut. All right, next 6 through 8, I got Gore, Aayla Secura, and the Invasion of Christophsis. So Gore's cool. I think this card can definitely see some play in these go wide strategies. The first place I've been looking at is something like a Wat Tambor build who wants a lot of cheap units so that cheap units die and then he gets buffs. Gore costing 6, potentially pretty impactful, especially because he can then curve into something like a Maul at 7, and they're both just like giant ambushing overwhelm. So you really can set up an early game where your plan is just to go like 6 Gore, eat your board, hit for a giant overwhelm, and then 7 do it with Maul, and maybe try to finish the games out that way. He's very narrow in his applications, of course, because, you know, you're not really happy to play him for more than 6, maybe 8 sometimes. So you usually need to be playing in a deck that has fodder units. Those usually are the green villain decks. So maybe narrow, but I think he's pretty interesting, and he's going to be the showdown promo. So that actually is really cool. It's going to be a legendary again, like it was in set 1. Aayla Secura. So this is definitely in the bucket of good with Energy Conversion Lab, but I actually think it is quite good with Energy Conversion Lab a lot of the time if you're able to get that coordinate online. So think with a cheaper leader as well, it will help because you're able to like, you have a leader and Aayla, so you would only need one other unit out. But if she can knock into something, kill it, and then stay behind as a 6/5, that can be pretty impactful. Energy Conversion Lab, obviously very good. The question is, what are your other targets, right? If you're playing in Red Hero, for instance, would you pick her over something like Poe and Wrecker? That would be tough, right? But Red Hero is not the only deck that can run something like an Energy Conversion Lab. So my favorite place I would look at right now with her is Quinlan Voss, because as a 5-cost unit, she would then be able to also do an extra damage to a 5-cost unit with Quinlan. So what does that mean? Well, it means she can one-shot Boba Fett leader no matter what, because you don't need your leader out to do Quinlan's ability. So the same way Steadfast Battalion was often used to kind of block Boba's deploy, but always required you to deploy your leader first, Aayla can do the same exact thing in Quinlan Voss and not even need Quinlan to be out. So she can come in, do the 7 to a 5-cost leader. Of course, she could kill like an opposing Quinlan as well, because he's another 7-cost leader. So really interesting stuff. I think it's a decent card, and certainly has the power level to be in that like good with ECL tier of cards. And the last one in this is maybe wishful thinking, but Invasion of Christophsis is a one-sided board wipe, obviously exploit 4. This card will either be completely unplayable or really, really good. So I put it here kind of in the middle of the legendary tiers. Requires a ton of setup, but blue, especially like some blue villain, does have fodder units. Green villain has the most fodder units, so like the first place we'd probably be looking at is green-blue villain. You got droids. You use a lot of droids. If you can turn this into a 7-cost board wipe, especially if you also still can keep units in play. That can be pretty massive, right? Super Laser Blast downside often is that you can't even like deploy your leader first, but think about something like with Count Dooku, he deploys on 7, so you can like do this board wipe and then deploy him, or even deploy him first, right? So the one-sided nature of this is really cool. There is a lot of ceiling on this. There's of course a potential that this just can never be good enough because it's just too easy to play around. So a little unsure about it, but it's cool. All right, next we got 2 through 5. These are kind of the heavy hitters here. Ahsoka, you know, I don't think this card is amazing by any means. It's like maybe not even better than Ezra, but she's good. It's like she's just a good rate card. It'll sometimes have ambush, especially if we see like these go wide droid decks, like your opponent goes turn 1 droid deployment. She knocks one of those out, or if they play any of the units that die into units and you're able to like work through that and give her ambush. Of course, in yellow hero, you can also start with like a Spark of Rebellion, which means more chances for your opponent to just out unit you, and then Ahsoka has ambush. But you know, she's a force unit for 3. She's got decent stats. The other action is more upside, so it's just a fine card. It'll likely see play in some variety of yellow hero decks, maybe not all of them and maybe not all the time, but it's just like a pretty safe card. It's got a safe power level. It's a high floor, maybe not an amazing ceiling, but just a good card. Darth Maul, maybe this one is also a little bit wishful thinking. I mean, I think the card is very good, but I think it's also one of those, like we talked with Ayla, entirely dependent on Energy Conversion Lab. I would not play this card without Energy Conversion Lab, but I think it is now the best 5-cost Energy Conversion Lab for a red villain deck. So is there a red-green villain deck that ends up being good enough and supports this card? Potentially. You got to look at the red villains, right? We got Vader, we've got IG, we've got Kylo, Pre-Vizsla now, Maul, the leader Maul. Definitely missing one. But anyway, it's an interesting card, and it's very powerful with Energy Conversion Lab. If it's able to ever kill 2 units and survive, right? So if those 2 units only have a combined power 5 and this is able to knock them both out and stay behind, massive potential there. I put Cad Bane on this list. He has the power level needed, I think, at the 7-cost range for a yellow villain deck. That yellow villain didn't really have a 7-drop that it really wanted to play. Like Dryden Voss was that power play, but never really hit because capture mechanic was not very good. Now, interestingly enough, this captures, so like you could play this alongside with Dryden, but I don't think that's really where we're going. I think Cad Bane is just interesting because he can kind of like one-sided board wipe when he comes into play. So very high ceiling, right? If they can't interact with this, this can eat so much from your opponent's board. The downside here, unlike cards like Vader, Luke, Han, like the other major 7s that we see getting played all the time, is that his effect is not permanent. So with Luke, he comes down, he kills something. If he gets killed, it's not like that thing that you defeated revives, right? But that is kind of what happens with Cad Bane, right? If he comes down and he captures a bunch of things, and then your opponent fells the dragon him, or bounces him, or whatever, they just get all the stuff back. So his effect is temporary. But, you know, he can eat way more stuff than Luke and Vader and this. So he can really swing a board. He has that on attack trigger, which is interesting, especially if he like captured something not so impactful. You can give it back, draw 2 cards. So that's pretty cool. He's got good traits, Underworld and Bounty Hunter. So with the card next to him that we're about to talk, he could potentially create some synergies there, especially because, you know, the Boba leader costs 5 and can be, with now there are 2 of them, which we're about to talk to, can cheat out a Cad Bane early. So I think Cad Bane could see play, certainly. No, not necessarily, because at this point we have just so many good cards and like good 7s that if he's not better than the other ones that we want to play, he won't fit. But even like a mono yellow deck did not have access to a card of this power level in villain, so Cad Bane definitely gives them an option there. And then now there are 2 of them. A card that I'm rating pretty high, but I also think is likely a bit overrated, maybe even by me for putting it this high. But I'm putting this high because there is potential here for some broken stuff with it. if I have to make an honest prediction right now, I don't think this card will end up being amazing most of the time. But when it hits, it's going to hit really hard. And I think it's going to be very, very fun to build around. So maybe there's a little bit of that in the ranking here. But basically, there are a lot of conditions to this card, right? You need only one unit in play. It needs to match a trait of another card in your hand. And then you need to be like needing to cheat out by 2 resources, right? So this falls in a similar camp to things like Sneak Attack and Triple Dark Raid and stuff like that. Those cards are not permanent. They're temporary, but they also bring in the unit ready. So you get like the buff that way. Whereas now there are 2 of them is permanent. But it's not like a readied unit, and of course it has these other restrictions, right? Unlike Sneak Attack and Triple Dark Raid, this also can't turn into a vehicle. It is a trick. Nice upside there with Jabba, because Jabba can go find it. Another little bit of a downside here is similar to Sneak Attack. It costs you a card, right? Because you're playing this and a card from your hand, something that Triple Dark Raid does not, because it brings a card from your deck. So there's a lot to unpack here, but some power plays are going to usually, in my opinion, involve around either going like a turn 1 unit and then playing, now there are 2 of them on the second turn, and bringing out a 5-drop. So like if you have like a turn 2 Rebel, or not Rebel, Republic, right? You can like, now there are 2 of them and get a 5-drop Republic. There's a lot of those in the game right now. Pretty cool. Or I think at 5, where you go from 5 to 7 and you get some of these like giant units, right? You can go like a Force unit into like a 7, which would be like Luke, or these Underworld or Bounty Hunters, where you can go like Boba leader into like a Maul or a Cad Bane. Those are going to be pretty interesting power plays if you can pull them off. Of course, you can do it with Jabba as well. We can go find the card, and then Jabba is an Underworld, and he can turn into, you can use it to like go get Cad Bane or Maul or something like that. So a lot of upside here. I think likely, like I said, it might end up being too cute. It might not work all the time, and it might start getting trimmed, but there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with this. So I put it up here in the rankings because of that. And number 1, we get only 1 card. It's General Grievous, and this is probably not a flashy pick. Largely, I think this has no text. Everything under the 4/4 there is largely irrelevant. Think of it as flavor text. It's never going to happen in a competitive game. I mean, watch it now happen in a competitive game. But anyway, it's still the first 3-cost 4/4 unit in the game without a downside, which is massive. It is a very good stat line. It is better, probably the best 3-cost stat line we have. It's interesting that it came in Blue Villain, because Blue Villain is not known for having efficient stat lines on its early units. But in this set, it did get a couple, so we might even be able to start working on Blue Villain decks that are not pure control. Like, they have some pretty good on rate early units now, and highlighted specifically by General Grievous. He has good traits, right? Separatist means that he can work decently with Dooku. Dooku can make him cost 1, which is cool. He's got Official, which is, you know, only relevant with Emperor's Royal Guard, but still relevant. He's a villain 3-drop, which means Darth Vader can go fetch him from your deck. And yeah, he's just a good turn 2 play, because he kills everything on the turn 1 play and survives, and he hits harder than most 3-drops do, right? Because the most popular stat line at 3-drops now is like a 3/5 or 3/4, and he eats the 3/4 and outraces the 3/5s. He's also a very good overwhelming barrage target, right? If you wanted to do something like that. He's a decent early ambush unit if you paired him with Energy Conversion Lab or Timely Intervention. There's just a lot going on here. And yeah, you can treat that text box as basically blank, but this is a safe pick. It is unlikely that this will actually end up being like the best card in the set, maybe, or like the best legendary, but there's basically no way that it isn't good and played. And that's why I just put it at 1. I think it's like the safest pick, maybe not the flashiest one, but it is a good card, and I'd be pretty excited to open it. All right, that's it for the legendary card ranks for Twilight of the Republic. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think of the cards, and yeah, until next time, take care.